Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Miller, and welcome to this lecture on Mahavira and the Fordmakers. This lecture will follow Paul Dundas's book, The Jains, pages 22 through 44. Depicted here, you see the 24 TIRTHANKARAS, or Fordmakers of the Jain tradition. These are the significant spiritual exemplars, or leaders, who have shown the path to liberation and the way to perfect nonviolence and live a proper Jain life. The topics that we'll specifically cover are that we will look at the most significant of these 24 Fordmakers, or TIRTHANKARAS, which I'll explain the meaning of in just a moment. And we'll also look at the life and teachings of Mahavira. Mahavira is the last of the 24 TIRTHANKARAS, said to possibly be contemporaneous with the Buddha, perhaps before, but probably contemporaneous with the Buddha. And he is perhaps, the most important within this tradition. So we're going to spend more time devoting ourselves to his story, but we'll also look at several other important Fordmakers in this lecture. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 24 TIRTHANKARAS. Dundas mentions 4 of the most prominent, and I'm adding in here a 5th, as we'll see why that is in just a moment. The first of the TIRTHANKARAS is Urshaba. Urshaba means bull. And you'll see his picture here to the right in this picture from Museum Rietberg in Zurich, where I'm meeting with the director of the museum, Johannes Belz, who gave us a tour and showed us this very important piece down in the basement of the underground part of the museum, where there are quite a few Jain figures. And Urshaba, this particular 11th to 12th century image of Urshaba, is something that the museum is famous for. If you're ever in Switzerland, in Zurich, I highly recommend that you go see this. So we'll talk about Urshaba, we'll talk about his life story, and we'll talk about how he achieved liberation. The second that I'm adding here that Dundas does not discuss in much detail is MALLI. MALLI is the only female Tirthankara in the Jain tradition, and specifically within the Shvetambara tradition. We'll talk about the different sects of Jainism, but the Shvetambaras, as opposed to the Digambaras, believe that MALLI was a female and that she attained liberation. So she's very important that way. Number 3, we'll look at NEMI. So NEMI is the 22nd Tirthankara. Then we'll look at PARSVA, who's number 23. And finally, Mahavira, number 24, the most recent and perhaps most important of the 24 Tirthankaras. We will look at his life story as well. So Urshaba, to begin with Urshaba, I mentioned that Urshaba's name means bull. Urshaba may indeed be a historical person. We don't know for sure, but in the Rig Veda, which is a text, the earliest text of the Vedic tradition and what will become the Hindu tradition, his name is used to depict a Kaishan Muni. Okay, a Kaishan Muni, if you may or may not know, was a sage or an ascetic who was sort of on the fringes of society and yet respected by Vedic society, ancient Vedic society. So when we talk about the Rig Veda, we're talking about probably 1500 to 1200 BCE in terms of the timing of this text. So in this text, there is a Kaishan Muni, a sage, who is named Urshaba. His name means bull, and he's at the fringes of society and yet respected. Dundas speculates that perhaps because Urshaba is in this earliest text, that he is a sage on the fringes of society and that he is an important, somewhat important figure, being a Kaishan Muni in the Rig Veda, that the Jain tradition may have appropriated his name into their own tradition to name the first Tirthankara. They did this in order to tie themselves in with the tradition, the Vedic tradition, which preceded them historically, but also in a way to show that they were there, that their founder, the first Tirthankara, was part of the Vedic tradition. He was just one of those sages who wasn't at the center of society, but was there and was doing the work, doing the spiritual work, but he was on the fringes of society. So it's possible that this name comes from the Rig Veda for that reason. It might have been a structural necessity for the Jains to incorporate themselves into this broader Vedic cultural milieu and yet show that they are distinct from it. Now, Urshaba, like I mentioned in the previous lecture, was very large and had a very long life. Because as you'll recall, the Tirthankaras at the beginning, as time is going on and things are getting worse, at the beginning, they're very big and they have very long lives. As time gets closer to all the way up to Mahavira, they end up being the same size as us humans and living human lifespans. But Urshaba, being the first, was very large and had a very long life. He himself renounced because at a particular time in his kingly court, Indra, again a god from the Hindu pantheon, had arranged for some dancers to come and perform in the royal court. One of these dancers, however, died during the performance, and Urshaba, seeing death for the first time in front of him, reflected on what it means to be a human being and life, and and thought that there might be something more to just engaging in sense pleasures, and started to think about what comes next. What is the ultimate pursuit of the human being? We all face death. What am I doing with my life? Right? So he had that aha wake up moment, as we'll see. All the Tirthankaras tend to have that at some point. So he saw the death of this dancer and he renounced. He became an ascetic. He went out and led a spiritual life. He turned over his kingdom to his sons. He split it up among his sons. And he went out into the forest where he wandered without food for a year. Some accounts say a year. Other accounts say 1,000 years, because we're talking about big time and long lifespans, remember, in these early accounts. So he wandered without food for a year, perhaps 1,000 years. And some accounts say that he eventually died in a forest fire, which was something akin to what is known as salekana. Salekana, as we'll see, is one where one willingly accepts death and eventually starves and dehydrates themselves to the point where they finally just leave their body by leaving their breath behind. So we'll see how that works in a future lecture. But essentially, Urshaba may have stayed in this forest fire voluntarily, purified himself, and achieved, as a result, liberation. So he's the first of the Tirthankaras, or Fordmakers, to achieve liberation. And that is precisely what the word Tirthankara is pointing towards. A tirtha, the first part of the word Tirthankara, a tirtha is a bridge. And kara means to make or construct or do. And so a Tirthankara is building a bridge between this worldly life of pleasure and so on and so forth and human pursuit and spiritual freedom. So he or she is helping us cross over into that other dimension, into that other possibility where the soul and the self is itself free from the suffering of this world forever and ever and ever. So Urshaba is the first person to have done that, as he died perhaps voluntarily in a forest fire after performing years, or maybe just a year, but a long, long time of austere practice and ascetic practice by going without food and eventually achieving liberation. So you see here pictured to the right, again, this is Urshaba. Urshaba is between my friend Jayesh and I. Jayesh is a member of the Swiss Jain community who went on this tour with me in Museum Rietberg. And again, this is a very important piece that's in the museum, and it's worth seeing. So you see him standing here in a pose known as Kayot Sarga. This is where Jains or Jain ascetics will stand still and motionless with their eyes closed, not moving for a very long period of time, which creates heat in the body, which then creates some form of spiritual purification and eventually liberation, right? So there is Urshaba in this 11th, 12th century image, modeling this behavior and modeling this ascetic life for us to this day. Okay, so Urshaba, the first of the 24. Then there are many more, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I want to talk about MALLI, because MALLI is, again, the only female Tirthankara in the Jain tradition. MALLI shows females in the Shvetambara sect, and we'll see why in a future lecture, but shows females in the Shvetambara sect that it is possible to achieve liberation as a female. In a patriarchal society, that is a significant statement to make. It is extremely significant because, generally speaking, women are not given that privilege. But in this particular sect, and due to the life that MALLI lived, we see that there is a potential for females to achieve liberation. MALLI has a really interesting story. In a previous life, she was a king. She was a king, so she was a male. She was in a male body. Her soul was in a male body. And her soul in this male body was a king. And she had other king friends. She had 6 other king friends. And all of them eventually one day decided that, you know, the worldly life, this material life, doesn't ultimately satisfy. So we've seen this trend with Vedic sacrificial culture and so on and so forth, that eventually there comes a point in your life where you no longer want to, you want to go on a spiritual quest, a spiritual pursuit, to see what else there is beyond the constant consumption and the constant materialism and fulfilling of human desires. So she and her 6 other friends, at the time, they're all male, right? They're all kings, decide to become ascetics together. And they perform austerities together. So they're fasting together. They're doing all sorts of things to burn their karma away, as we mentioned before. They want to burn their karma away and release their souls, ultimately forever and ever, so they don't have to go through this constant cycle of death and rebirth anymore. Well, MALLI at the time, as the king, is overambitious. And all of her friends, or his friends at the time, really looked up to him. He was overambitious, and while they performed austerities, and when they decided to stop performing austerities, so they would stop fasting for a period of time, he would continue to perform austerities without telling them. So he wouldn't take food, for example. He would allow himself to continue to burn karma, to try to get ahead of his friends and stay ahead of his friends, because he liked that his friends looked up to him, right? So eventually the king and MALLI, who will become MALLI, and his friends, they all pass away, they all die, and then they're born into really good lives again in the future, because they've done a lot of ascetic practice and they burned a lot of their karma, but they haven't achieved liberation yet. They're born again into a new life, and MALLI, because he in a prior life did those things, tried to outdo his friends and was proud and tried to have his friends looking up to him for being better than they were, was born as a female. So MALLI's punishment was to be born as a female. So you can see that this is coming out of a very patriarchal background where the female is not looked upon as good as the male, right? So MALLI is born as a princess in a kingly court, a very beautiful princess on account of her previous ascetic practice. And so she's very powerful, she's very beautiful. And there are kings living all around in the kingdom around her, and other kingdoms around her, and princes who eventually get wind of the fact that there's this very beautiful princess in the neighborhood, and they all at one point go approach her to ask for her hand in marriage because they want to marry her. She's beautiful, she's powerful, she's the daughter of a king, she's a princess. And so they all eventually ask for her hand in marriage. She denies all of them, all of these kings. And so all of them come together at one point to the king's castle and actually demand her to come out of the castle because they all want to marry her. They're all very upset that they've been rejected, and they all show up to the castle. Well, guess how many of those kings there are? There are 6 of them, okay? So there's MALLI, and then there's these 6 kings who all really look up to her and really want to be with her, okay? So we can see where this is going. And so the king, MALLI's father, looks down and says, what am I going to do? There's 6 kings with their armies coming to take you. And MALLI, being as really smart as she is, says, you know what, Dad, let the 6 kings come into the castle and come up to my room. And the king says, well, are you crazy? I'm not going to let them all in here. They're going to take you away. She says, no, Dad, just trust me. I've got a plan. So the king listens to his daughter and lets all the kings in, and they're all led to a room where there are 6 doors looking into the room. So they're all standing around these 6 doors, and they're each looking in. And on the inside of this room, there is a beautiful golden replica statue of MALLI standing in the middle. And at first, these kings all think that it actually is MALLI, and they're totally overtaken by the beauty of this statue. It's more beautiful than they could have ever imagined, and they all really want to marry her. Well, just at that moment, as they're getting really excited, MALLI actually comes in next to the statue and says, hey, everyone. And the kings are all looking at her, thinking, what are you doing? Why are there 2 of you? And she says, I have to tell you something. She lifts up a latch on the statue, and an awful smell comes out of the statue itself. And all the kings immediately, cover their mouth, and they're just disgusted with whatever the smell is. And they say, what is that? This is so beautiful, but now there's this awful smell here. Well, MALLI then goes on to explain to them that over the past few days, she had been having her maidservant put rotten food into the statue so that it would create a stench, and then she just opened it up. It's almost like a compost bin. When you open a compost bin after a long time, a stench will come out, right? Well, that stench is now filling the room. And she says to the 6 kings, look, you all want to marry me, but I put this same food into my body, and the only reason my body right now doesn't smell like this food is because my body with the soul inside of it is digesting it and keeping it from smelling and rotting. Okay, so that's how she interprets food going through her body. And she says, my soul is keeping the food from rotting in my body, and so you don't smell it right now, but eventually I'm going to wither away like this food, and I am going to smell like this food. You may think I'm beautiful now, but I'm going to smell like this food. That's where I'm headed. That's where we're all headed. And all the kings are really shocked and say, wow, what a profound teaching. And then MALLI goes on to finally make the big reveal. We've probably all heard of something called past life regression. Past life regression is where you have a memory of a prior life, something that happened in a prior life that informs your current situation and why you are where you are now. It's almost like reflecting on your karma, right? Well, MALLI must have had a past life regression, because she says to them, I need to tell you all why we're here. In a prior life, we were all kings together. There were 7 of us, but during our austerities, while we were performing our austerities, when we became ascetics together, I decided to keep practicing because I wanted to impress you and I wanted to be better than you. And so here we all are again. You're all looking up to me for me and how great I am, just as you did in a prior life. But now we need to get over this. We need to burn through this karma, and we need to stop this cycle from happening over and over again. So she proposes, I'm going to go renounce the world now. And her 6 friends again follow her into renunciation. But this time she doesn't try to keep any secrets from them. She doesn't try to outdo them, but she commits herself to a spiritual life and eventually achieves, along with her friends later, liberation. So she's liberated as a female in a female body, and she attracts a large following and teaches a large following of disciples. And she remains to this day an important figure within the Jain tradition on account of the fact that she was not only a Tirthankara, one who built the bridge from this world to the world of liberation, but that she was female, okay? And there have been several images of her found around India that depict her as female. So we can see this was actually also in iconography a thing. So you see in the picture to the right here, from the 7th century of the Common Era, AD, the image of MALLI with a braid running down her back, right? We can see there's a braid running down her back, and she clearly has female breasts, right? So this is not a male figure, and there are other images of her that are similar that depict her as female. So we know that this was a thing, and I highly recommend, if you want to see more about that, that you follow the link down on the bottom of this page where you'll see the other images of MALLI that are dressed up as female and have all the female features that clearly show that this is a female Tirthankara. Okay, so there's NEMI, 19, right? So we've gone Urshaba 1, then we jumped all the way to 19, MALLI, and then 22, NEMI, NEMI. NEMI was a cattle herder, was born into a cattle herder family. NEMI was therefore fond of animals because NEMI's job was to be close with them and to take care of them on a regular basis with his family. So NEMI, having this predisposition towards animals already, having this great affection for animals, was already set up for what's going to happen next. So one day, NEMI, being royal as he became, was on his way to his wedding. And you see here in the image below the wedding procession of NEMI. You can see the long line coming all the way from one place to another, about to go into the kingdom, into the fortress here for his wedding. And on the way into his wedding, he was sitting there with his soon-to-be bride, and he suddenly heard animals making sounds. And they weren't They were sounds of despair. They weren't just animals making regular sounds. They were sounds of despair, and he could hear that there were animals suffering nearby. Remember, he had a very sensitive heart for animals because he was fond of them from growing up with them in a cattle herding family. He could tell that these animals were in despair. And so what he did was he asked the driver, what is going on? Why are there animals making these sounds, and why are they in such despair? And the driver turned around and said, you don't know? Well, of course, for your festival, for your wedding festival, we need to eat a meal. We need some food. And all the animals that you see here, and you can see some of them depicted here in this image, that are behind the walls, behind the gates, behind the fences, are about to be slaughtered and cooked for your wedding meal. Now, for NEMI, this is not acceptable. He gets the sense that these animals that are in desperation, much as they are, for example, in a contemporary factory farm, they're scared. They're feeling all sorts of fear and emotions. They don't know what's going on. They're in very uncomfortable physical conditions, right? He says, this is not acceptable. I won't accept this just for my wedding. I will not accept that all these animals will be tortured, put through emotional and mental pain, and ultimately eaten. This is not okay. So he stops the procession. He orders the animals to be released. And so you can see the animals here that were locked up were released. And he becomes this big hero for this because he has decided that he does not want to go on, one, with the wedding, or one, with eating the animals, and two, with the wedding, because then he decides that he wants to renounce. And after this, he decides, instead of getting married, he and his wife, or his wife-to-be, will renounce together and eventually achieve liberation. So NEMI, as depicted in this mural, as you see in the top right, eventually achieves liberation and gives teachings as a Tirthankara to others about nonviolence, right? Because ultimately what this represents is compassion for animals, as well as a commitment to a life of nonviolence, right? So NEMI was not willing to allow animals to suffer and be tortured and killed and eaten just for him. And that is what he's very well known for, and he's still worshipped to this day. So NEMI is very important when we think about the Jain concept of nonviolence. Okay, so as we can see, animals are a big part of these stories. And PARSVA's story is no different. PARSVA is the 23rd of 24 Tirthankaras. He may or may not have been a historical person. Most Jains will say that he was. According to Dundas and other scholars, we don't have absolute proof that PARSVA was a historical person. But if he was, he probably lived sometime in the 8th or 7th century BCE. So of all the Tirthankaras, PARSVA is the first that is maybe a historical person, while Mahavira is probably the most certain. The Tirthankara that we'll look at next is probably the Tirthankara who was actually a living human person. Okay, PARSVA also has an interesting story that's wrapped up with animals and nonviolence. In a prior life, PARSVA was a prince and was looking down over his balcony and saw a procession of people following an ascetic from out of the Vedic tradition, right, the Hindu tradition, toward some sort of sacrifice. And so he didn't know that was what it was at the time, but he wanted to figure out what it was. So he went down from his balcony, went outside of his castle, and he went down and he started asking people, what's going on here? And they told him, look, there's this person from the Vedic order who's going to perform a sacrifice, a fire sacrifice. And he's interested and he's intrigued about, what does this mean? What's this going to be like? And so he follows them with the ascetic, follows them to the sacrifice and arrives at the fire. And just then the sacrificial fire, because as you recall, things are poured into the fire in these Vedic traditions. Just as he's about to start the sacrifice, PARSVA notices that there are two snakes inside of the logs that are burning inside the fire, right? So PARSVA, seeing that, goes up to the Vedic, the sacrificer, and says, you need to put this fire out and kick these logs out right now. I order you to do this, because if you don't, the snakes are going to die inside that log. They're going to burn to death. And this person performing the sacrifice says to him, you silly, what do you know? you're not in my caste. You don't understand what I'm doing. You don't understand the nature of the sacrifice. Leave me alone. Well, PARSVA, being powerful as he was, ordered his guards to kick the logs down out of the fire. And sure enough, 2 snakes come out burning to death. And there they are laying on the ground suffering. And PARSVA's like, I told you so. And he goes over to the snakes. The first thing he does is he goes over to the snakes and he tells the snakes, it's a male and a female snake, and he tells them, don't hate this man who has burned you to death. Don't think about those things. Think about good thoughts as you make your way to death, so that you will be reborn into a better life in the future for the suffering that you have endured, and you will not accrue karma because you will not have bad thoughts toward this man who did these things to you. So the 2 snakes, listening to him, slowly die, and then are reborn eventually into the snake kingdom again, but as the king and queen of the snake kingdom. So time goes on, and PARSVA eventually, as PARSVA, eventually as all the Tirthankaras do, will try to achieve liberation. And after renouncing from this encounter with the snakes, right, because eventually all of the Tirthankaras have some big wake-up moment. So PARSVA renounces, and after renouncing, he goes and he performs that meditation, Kayotsarga, that we saw with Urshaba, where he's standing under a tree and he's standing still so as to perfect nonviolence, to burn all his karma away. And as he's getting closer and closer to achieving liberation, he starts to get attacked by demons and people who don't want him to achieve liberation, right? Everything's going to come at him to try to challenge him away from his pursuit of liberation. And that's exactly what happens. So what they end up doing is they end up raining on him. They cause it to rain on him and flood around him while he's standing in Kayotsarga, that upright position. He's standing underneath a tree. And as the water starts to go up and up and up, it starts to get close to the point where it's going to drown him. But PARSVA, being committed to achieving liberation, does not move. He does not let fear move him, okay? And this is the point where something like grace is going to come back and save him, right? But it's not grace, it's karma. Because what happens is the king and the queen snake that had been reborn into as the king and queen of the snake kingdom immediately come to his rescue just before he is covered by water. The queen goes underneath him and lifts him up so his head comes above the water. And then the king puts his cobra hood over PARSVA's head to protect him from the elements and from the rain, so he can continue to stand there until he achieves liberation. Now, as you can see, images of PARSVA are always depicted with that cobra hood going over his head, as well as the cobra underneath him. You see the cobra image that depicts this as PARSVA. So you know this is PARSVA because you see the cobra and then you remember the cobra story. All of the Tirthankaras will have an image underneath them that depicts something about them that's unique. And that reminds you, that tells you who it is, because oftentimes you can't tell because they all look the same, right? PARSVA is very distinct because he tends to be black and he tends to have these cobras around him. Okay, so why is this all important? Well, again, like NEMI in the previous story, it depicts a lesson of compassion and nonviolence in the spiritual path, right? PARSVA was compassionate towards the snakes who were burning in the fire. He kicked them out and saved them, even though they were going to die. He helped them get into a better birth. He wanted to perfect nonviolence. He was trying to have the ascetic who was doing this fire commit to nonviolence, right? Or at least demonstrate what nonviolence was by not killing the snakes, but they eventually die. But as a result, they came back and they helped him in a future life. So as you see in number 2, 3, and 4, because of this compassion and nonviolence, it shows that a fellowship with all creatures must be cultivated within the Jain tradition. So it's not just human to human relations, but a fellowship and good relations have to be made with all of nature and all of reality, right? And we still see that today in animal hospitals that are opened by Jains and funded by Jains to help animals and to rescue animals from slaughter, so on and so forth. So there's a fellowship with all creatures, not just humans. There's a rejection of the Vedic sacrifice, right? So PARSVA didn't care that this this priest was performing a sacrifice and that he had all this Vedic knowledge and wisdom. What he cared about was that there was some animal dying as a result of this in the sacrifice. And oftentimes animals were sacrificed in Vedic sacrifice, right? So the story depicts a rejection of the Vedic sacrifice. And it shows also, number 4, that all actions bind individuals together. Because PARSVA did what he did for these snakes, they returned the favor to him later, and he achieved liberation. So PARSVA is very famous for this story and very important today, still in the Jain tradition. According to some accounts, as Dundas points out, and these are probably the Shvetambara accounts, so we'll look at who the Shvetambaras are in a future lecture again. PARSVA taught a fourfold restraint. Okay, so how do you practice asceticism and austerity and become liberated? You have to practice this fourfold restraint. The first one we already know, nonviolence, right? Ultimately in the Jain tradition, everything boils down to nonviolence. You have to perfect nonviolence. He exemplified this by trying to save the snakes from dying, and NEMI did as well by saving the animals from slaughter for his wedding, and we'll see Mahavira did in his own way in the future. So nonviolence is the first of the fourfold restraint, okay, within the Jain tradition, said to have been created by PARSVA by some people in the Jain tradition. These 4 things, nonviolence being the first. The second is truth, living a life of honesty and living according to the way that Jains understood reality to be constructed, which essentially means that eventually you need to burn all of your karma and respect the hierarchy of life. Respect your place as a human in the cosmos, which is that you have a soul that can be liberated in this human life, and you should pursue that. Okay, so nonviolence, truth of the highest order, not stealing, so don't steal from others, right? Because that shows greed and attachment. And so does number 4, non-possession. If you possess things, you're attached to things, you're not going to achieve liberation in this life. You have to give up all possessions. And that's precisely, as we'll see, what the monks and nuns attempt to do in order to achieve liberation. All 4 of these things, right? They live a very simple life, try not to harm anything, try to be honest, and don't steal. PARSVA, as you see in the last bullet point, as I mentioned before, remains a great focus of contemporary Jain devotional activity and is said to remove obstacles, okay? And so you see here in the image to the right, an activity being done to worship PARSVA in contemporary Jain devotional activity and ritual. And so he remains important for so many reasons. And one of the things he's thought to do is remove obstacles. Okay, this brings us to number 24, Mahavira, very important Tirthankara in the Jain tradition. According to Shvetambara accounts, so Shvetambaras again are one of 2 major sects within Jainism, Mahavira lived from 599 to 527 BCE. Okay, so that's a long time ago, and that's before the Buddha. Other recent scholarly accounts, as Dundas points out, have suggested that Mahavira actually lived in the 5th century and was a contemporary of the Buddha, right? So historically speaking, that's probably more accurate, but some still believe that he was born earlier in the 6th century and lived in the 6th century before the Buddha. He was born somewhere in the Gangetic Basin. Okay, so if you recall from the first lecture, the Gangetic Basin was that area in northeast India where it was considered to be impure by those in the more northwestern part who were of Vedic society, right? So within this Gangetic Basin, as we recall also from the previous lecture, there was this ascetic culture arising. As the second urbanization came to this area in India, people from not only the Vedic tradition, but from what would become the Jain and Buddhist tradition, begin to try to figure out ways to escape suffering. And this is all happening within a shared ascetic milieu in this Gangetic Basin, and that is where Mahavira was born. His name, as you may recall, was Vardhamana. His name was Vardhamana because when he was born, he increased the wealth of his parents significantly and of his kingdom, right? So he's given the name Vardhamana, which means to increase or expand something. And in this case, it was the wealth of his family. His parents may have been followers of PARSVA's lineage, as you see in number 4 here, bullet point number 4. So PARSVA, if he was a historical figure, may have created a lineage into which Mahavira was born. Okay, so he may have already been born into some sort of lineage that descended from PARSVA, who we saw in the previous slide. And what Mahavira does, according to some accounts, is he adds a number 5 to the vows that PARSVA had given, the fourfold vow that PARSVA gave in the previous list that I just showed you, right? So in addition to nonviolence, in addition to truth, not stealing, and non-possession, Mahavira adds celibacy, okay? And he converts his disciples to a new way of living the ascetic life. And it is said in some accounts that celibacy was added because Mahavira, as time went on, had to remind people that, you know, as the world was declining, you remember we're in the Avasarpani, the downfall of morality, he had to remind people that they couldn't have sex, and especially if they were wandering naked with one another, that they were not allowed to have sex with one another, because to have sex with someone is to show attachment to worldly life, and to have attachment to worldly life goes totally against liberation and liberating your soul from the body and all of its desires, right? So Mahavira adds number 5, celibacy, to that list of 4 vows, and it becomes 5 great vows. So Mahavira's birth was, like all of the Tirthankaras, presaged by 14 dreams that had a number of important elements, including a white elephant. So if you look to the right here, you can see there are 14 bubbles popping around his mother, Trishala, who's sleeping on the bed pregnant with Mahavira. She has these 14 auspicious dreams, which indicate that she's going to give birth to a very special spiritual leader, which will become a Tirthankara. Now, interestingly, in Mahavira's story, Mahavira's embryo was actually transferred out of a woman from the Brahmin caste to Trishala into the warrior caste, right? Why is that important? Well, it does something to Brahmanical authority. As you may or may not know, the Brahmins were of the highest class within Indian society. They were the priests who dictated the sacrifice and dictated moral, spiritual authority, right? Well, what this story is essentially saying is that the embryo of this great spiritual hero could not be born into that caste. He was too great. He had to be born instead into the warrior caste or class, right below the Brahmins, okay, right below the priestly class. That was the appropriate place for a true spiritual hero to be born. So as Dundas points out, this, number 1, it devalorizes Brahmanical authority. It says your class was not good enough to give birth to this child. The warrior caste will do that, right? And all of the Tirthankaras are indeed born into the warrior caste or class. Number 2, as Dundas points out, like all the other Tirthankaras, but also not unlike the Buddha or even Jesus, Mahavira has an unusual birth that follows a theme in other religious traditions. And it is this unusual birth, this being transferred from another womb into that of Trishala, his mother in the warrior caste, and having all these dreams that presaged that he would be born as a great person, shows that he was indeed very unique and significant. Okay, so when he was born also, as you see in the last bullet point, he also had auspicious marks on his body, including the Chakravartin wheel, which was a symbol of royalty. Okay, so there's all these dreams, there's this transfer of the embryo, and there's also all of these auspicious marks, including the marks of a king on Mahavira's body when he's born. Now, Mahavira renounced the world at the age of 30 to wander around the world. He had a big wake up, like most of these ascetics do, and he began to wander around the world, and he renounced life, and he gave up, or attachment to life, he gave up all of his possessions, he handed over his clothing, he was with animals, and he was attacked by people and insects. He didn't wash himself. He was fasting, so he was depriving himself of food. He disregarded sleep, shelter, and contact with other humans. So he did a lot of things that made him very uncomfortable. And the purpose of this, again, was not to live a nasty life, but it was to burn away all of his karma to eventually achieve liberation, right? These austerities, as the pillow scripture says, were the pillow on which he rested his head, as you see in the last bullet point. It allowed him to control his mind and his body, abstain from action. He didn't accrue any new karma. He burned away all of his karma, and as we'll see eventually, as a result, achieve liberation. So you can see in the images to the right, he did a lot of things that made him uncomfortable, right? He gave away his clothing. He endured a lot of attacks from animals and insects, as well as from people who are not nice to him. And look how he's just standing there calmly, enduring all of these different sufferings. Okay, Mahavira was a great spiritual warrior, right? You see him again depicted here standing with his eyes closed and motionless. This is what it means to be a spiritual warrior. This is conquering oneself. This is what it means to go inside and not conquer the external world, but to conquer oneself, right? And while he was doing this, he did something very unique that not many people think about or do when they think about meditation. He stood there and he meditated motionless. His eyes were, however, open. And this is the thing I want to emphasize. His eyes were open. While his eyes were open, he saw that everything was imbued with life, that nothing wanted to suffer, and that everything wanted to live, right? This is a very unique kind of meditation. It's not unlike the insight that, for example, NEMI had when he heard the animals suffering and saw the animals suffering, right? He knew they didn't want to suffer, right? It's not unlike PARSVA, who saw the snakes burning in the fire. It's not unlike how he rescued them and knew that they didn't want to suffer, right? But it's very unique in the fact that this is an actual meditation with eyes open on all of life around him as he's standing motionless, burning his karma away, conquering himself. He also notices outside that fundamentally the whole world, from the smallest speck of dust all the way up to the human and everything in between, does not want to suffer and is imbued with life. And thus, as bullet point number 3 points out, true austerity and the true spiritual path, according to the Jain tradition, requires the perfection of nonviolence, or ahimsa. You must perfect nonviolence, not cause any harm to any being, from the smallest speck of dust all the way up to a human being. Because if you do, you accrue karma, you render yourself impure, right? And you have to continue to work to perfect it. That's why they're emotionless. That's why they're not moving. That's why ultimately, even at the end of life, a Jain Tirthankara, or a monk or nun, will voluntarily relinquish even their breath, so they don't even have to breathe anymore. Okay? This attitude, as you see in bullet point number 4, becomes a prerequisite for liberation and has to be adopted toward all of life. Not just humans, but all of life. And that's why most of the Jains are vegetarian, and many are actually moving towards veganism, because they recognize the destruction and the suffering caused by the factory farming system now in today's world. And they know that, according to their tradition, if they continue to inflict violence upon those other forms of life through those forms of dietary practice, of eating meat and so forth, that they're contributing to that suffering. So the Jain tradition recognizes that this attitude must be adopted towards all life, and it really challenges, as you see in the last bullet point, anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is the idea that the anthropos, the human, is the center of all reality and everything revolves around the human. While this is true somewhat in the Jain tradition, because you have to be born as a human to achieve liberation, Jainism also recognizes that anthropocentrism, the idea that the human is at the middle, the idea that comes out of the Western philosophical and biblical tradition, is in and of itself limited, in that it doesn't recognize that all life wants to live, all life does not want to suffer. So this is something very unique about the Jain tradition. Okay. Okay, and Mahavira's enlightenment. So it took Mahavira, so as he was out doing this, meditating motionless with his eyes open on all of reality and so on and so forth, it took him 13 years of hard practice to eventually achieve enlightenment. So eventually, after standing motionless and enduring the elements and enduring all of this pain and suffering, he burned away all of his karma and he achieved enlightenment. Enlightenment in the Jain tradition can be referred to as moksha, as it is in Hinduism, but most specifically, the word that's specific to the Jain tradition is kevala, which you see in the first bullet point here. Kevala. Kevala is that moment of liberation when all karma is burned away, and this is what Mahavira achieved. And he did it in a farmer's field, and you see it depicted here on the right in this image. In the farmer's field, Mahavira went 2.5 days without water. Okay, imagine not drinking water for 2.5 days out in the full glare of the heat and the sun. In India, the sun is very hot. Okay, he did this close to a tree, and he was in a very difficult ascetic squatting posture, which you see to the right here. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to a yoga class where you have to do this posture, because they still teach a posture like this in the yoga, in modern yoga traditions. But after you stand on your toes for a very long period of time like this, not only do your legs burn, but your toes really hurt. This is an extremely uncomfortable position to be in. So he's in that position. He's there for 2.5 days in the full glare of the sun, in this awfully painful ascetic squatting posture. But as a result, as you can see, he's not even wincing. Look at his face, so peaceful. He gains omniscience. So he gains knowledge of everything, basically, which is tantamount to the experience of liberation, kevala. He's isolated his soul from the sufferings of the body and the world and the mind. Now, like all Tirthankaras and spiritual teachers, after achieving liberation, Mahavira goes on to preach and share his teachings with the world. This happens in a place called Kampa at a Yaksha shrine, and you see it being depicted here to the right in this image. The Jain tradition is perhaps connected with these tree worshipping cults that were already existing in North India at the time. As we saw in the previous lecture, Harikesha, if you recall, the Jain ascetic who asked the Brahmins for alms and was attacked by them, was rescued by a Yakshi at one of these shrines. So the Yakshi and Yakshas are the male and female gods and goddesses that are in these trees, these tree spirits, who are very closely connected with the Jain tradition, and in some cases rescued the Jains, such as Harikesha, from being attacked by the Brahmins. So you'll often see when these teachings are being given, it's being done at a Yaksha shrine, as you see here underneath the tree. At this first teaching, as you can see depicted in the image to the right, royalty, lay people, lay folks, so householders like you and I, ascetics, so other practitioners of spiritual practice, animals, and even the gods convened. And they convened in what is known as the Samavasarana. You see this in bullet point number 2, the Samavasarana. The Samavasarana is the space that you see depicted here in which Mahavira gave his teachings, right? And anytime you go into a Jain temple to this day, there is a recreation. The Jain temple is itself recreating the Samavasarana, where you see the Tirthankara, usually Mahavira and other Tirthankaras, depicted as giving the teachings at the center out in the 4 directions. So you can see here that Mahavira is stationed in 4 directions, giving the teachings essentially to all of reality in all of the 4 directions, okay? So as you see here, and if you look at this image, you see Mahavira at the center, then you see people gathered around him, so royalty, layfolk, and ascetics, and so forth, gathered around him in a circle, listening to his teachings. You see then behind the next wall, significantly, animals looking in, right? Animals are hearing these teachings. And in the Jain tradition, animals can have spiritual awakenings, okay? So you see these animals back there. And you see on the far outside, you see people trying to file into this very important teaching, right? This very important moment where teachings will be given. And then if you look to the top of the image, you also see these celestial vehicles where the gods and goddesses are coming to listen to the teachings of Mahavira. So essentially, everyone is showing up here, right? And this is also significant, as Dundas points out, because in bullet point number 3, you see in a Vedic sacrifice, okay, so from the Vedic or Hindu tradition, all according to the Jains, would gather to watch animals die in the sacrifice, right? But rather here, animals are invited to partake in the teachings themselves. They're not being sacrificed because that would go against the teaching of nonviolence. And so the depiction you see here is really cool because you can see that the animals are really interested and listening really attentively to Mahavira's teachings. Okay, so the all Jain temples, as I mentioned, you see in bullet point number 4, are a replication of this. They're a place for everyone to learn nonviolence, ahimsa. Now, one of the interesting things about the teachings that were given in the Samavasarana by Mahavira is that Mahavira's body itself gave off a divine sound. And you see the Sanskrit for that here in parentheses, Divya Divani, a divine sound to the people who would become his disciples, okay? The Ganadhara, the holders of the troop, the Gana. Remember, Gana was a militant term used to describe militant troops. Here it's being reinterpreted to be sort of spiritual troops. They're a troop of spiritual renunciants, his disciples, the Ganadhara. They receive that sound off of his body, right? Nobody else can understand the sound. But what happens is his disciples, his chosen disciples, then translate that sound and mediate it out to others around the world so that all can learn the teachings of the Jain tradition. So we'll see this again. We'll see it come up again in a future lecture, but it's important to know that Mahavira's teachings were given off through a sound that came off of his body. So perhaps the most significant or interesting of Mahavira's disciples who received the sound and then gave the teachings is Gautama, who you see pictured here to the right. Gautama called the gods to sacrifice, right? But because he was a Brahmin at the time, but they instead flew to hear the second teaching of Mahavira, the Samavasarana. So Gautama, being a Vedic priest, gets very upset. He said, I'm trying to call the gods to my sacrifice. They always show up when I call them because I'm going to make offerings to them, right? Why wouldn't they show up to my sacrifice? They've gone and they've flown to this other spiritual teacher outside of the Vedic tradition, to the Samavasarana, to listen to him. So you remember in the previous slide, when we look up here, we see those celestial objects looking down onto Mahavira giving the teachings. Well, here they are. They're supposed to be at Gautama's sacrifice, but they're not. They're listening to Mahavira instead. So they fly there, and Gautama gets very upset about this, and he comes to the Samavasarana, and he confronts Mahavira, right? And in debate, like, what are you doing, taking the gods away from the Vedic sacrifice? That's the worst thing you can do. That's so unorthodox. And he does this along with 10 other Brahmins. So 11 of them confront Mahavira, really upset. But Mahavira remains calm because he's liberated. He's not attached. And he proves to these Vedic Brahmin priests who perform sacrifices that the Veda is based on Jain principles. Okay, so he basically says the Vedas, you may think that they're talking about the sacrifice you're supposed to be performing, but they're based on Jain principles. And of course, ultimately, for a Jain, you have to internalize that sacrifice, right? You have to put it inside your body, burn your own karma, get rid of all your attachments, not try to get things from the gods as you try to do in Vedic sacrifice. And he eventually convinces them, and he converts them one by one to the Jain tradition, or to his teachings. They become the Ganadhara, the holders of the Gana. Now, Mahavira was a Kevalan, okay? Or Gautama became a Kevalan. Mahavira was a Kevalan. Kevalan means possessed of Kevala, being possessed of liberation, of the liberated state. Okay, so Mahavira had already achieved it. He was a Kevalan. And Gautama, with Mahavira's help, eventually himself becomes a Kevalan, one possessed of Kevala. He burned all his karma and he became liberated, right? So these are the people who are going to take Mahavira's teachings forward, get them written down, and so that we can have them all the way to this day. And interestingly, Gautama remains an object of Jain devotion to this day for his human qualities specifically. And he's often portrayed as somewhat corpulent, someone who can enjoy life a little bit, okay? And why is that important? Well, you know, the Tirthankaras have perfected everything. They are something we look up to, something we hope to aspire to be like in a future lifetime. We want to achieve liberation like them. But if we're a householder and we're raising a family and we have jobs and we're eating the food we like and so on and so forth, even if we're vegetarians or vegans in the Jain tradition, we look to someone like Gautama, right? If you're a Jain, you look to someone like Gautama because he represents the qualities of what it's like to kind of be human and be a little bit easier on yourself, right? You can enjoy life a little bit, still do good things and hope for a better birth in the future so you can eventually achieve liberation. But he remains an object of Jain devotion to this day for his human qualities, indeed. So this was a rather brief lecture that tried to cover some of the main aspects of the lives of the Fordmakers or TIRTHANKARAS, those who build a bridge between this reality and the next, right? To show us away from this world of delusion and suffering and constant rebirth into a place of ultimate freedom. I hope that you'll go look at these stories more carefully on your own, find a Tirthankara that's meaningful to you, and read his or her story over and over again, and be inspired to perhaps embark on some sort of spiritual path of your own. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.